Queen Camilla has just been arrested by royal bodyguards after Prince William asked him never to return again to Birmingham Palace. Welcome viewers to my channel. Please subscribe, like my video and turn on notifications so you don't miss our next update. It often begins with whispers. Not declarations, not headlines, not bold accusations, but whispers that travel like smoke through the corridors of power. Inside Birmingham Palace, those whispers had become so common that they almost seemed like part of the architecture, embedded in the walls themselves. Servants spoke in hushed tones when her name came up. Advisors chose their words carefully when discussing her influence. Even among the guards, who prided themselves on discretion, quiet conversations passed between them when they thought no one was listening. Queen Camilla had always been a controversial presence, but lately the atmosphere carried a tension sharper than before. Something was coming, and those who lived and worked in the palace could sense it before it arrived. The beginning of the storm could be traced back weeks earlier, when Camilla had been seen meeting with figures close to King Charles, sometimes without William's knowledge. Those meetings may have been innocent on the surface, discussions of engagements or ceremonial duties, but to William they represented a subtle attempt to extend influence where it did not belong. The heir to the throne had always been cautious about boundaries. His understanding of the monarchy was not shaped by romantic notions but by the scars of his childhood, the public battles of his parents, and the relentless gaze of the press. When he heard that Camilla had been overstepping, holding conversations and making decisions that touched areas he considered his future responsibility, he saw it not as duty but as intrusion. And behind every intrusion, he felt the echo of betrayal. These whispers spread like wildfire. Palace aides speculated that William had grown distant from his stepmother. Some suggested that his patience, long considered one of his greatest virtues, was thinning. Others recalled the moments, years ago, when William had begged his father not to marry her. To them, it was no surprise that the unspoken resentment had never truly vanished. It was only a matter of time before the surface calm cracked. Staff members, always careful not to be caught in the crossfire of royal tensions, began to notice the way William's voice tightened when her name was mentioned, the way his jaw clenched when discussions veered into her sphere of influence. They spoke quietly of an heir who was no longer willing to play the role of silent observer. The middle of this chapter lies in the tension between perception and reality. To the outside world, the monarchy projected unity. Public appearances showed smiles, carefully timed gestures of warmth, and the performance of stability. But behind the grand windows of Birmingham Palace, the truth was more fractured. Camilla had fought for years to be accepted as queen consort, and though she had won the title, she had not erased the doubts of the heir. William, who carried the memory of his mother like a permanent scar, was not prepared to surrender the future of the crown to a woman he still associated with his family's pain. Every quiet whisper of her influence behind closed doors deepened his resolve. Every reminder of her role in the past stiffened his resistance. And so, the palace became a stage where unspoken rivalries played out in subtle ways. Camilla, with her sharp wit and determination, continued to assert herself in the role she believed she had earned. William, with his measured composure and sense of duty, tightened his grip on the future. The staff found themselves caught between two figures, one representing the present and the other the coming reign. Bodyguards in particular felt the tension more than most. They had sworn to protect the monarchy, but what happens when the monarchy itself is divided? Whose command holds more weight, the wife of the reigning king, or the heir who will one day wear the crown? This unanswerable question lingered in the minds of those assigned to guard the palace, creating a quiet unease that only deepened with time. The whispers became louder when Camilla made it known that she intended to attend an event at Birmingham Palace, despite William's disapproval. Some said it was a small matter, a simple engagement that would barely draw notice. But in the language of royalty, every decision carries symbolic weight. Her presence in the palace was more than ceremonial. It was a direct challenge to the authority of the heir. And so, while the world outside remained oblivious, within the palace walls the tension grew unbearable. The guards rehearsed their movements, not knowing whose orders they might be called upon to follow. The aides carried messages back and forth, watching carefully for signs of a confrontation that felt more inevitable by the day. What makes this moment so compelling is not just the conflict itself, but the way it mirrors history. The British monarchy has always been haunted by family feuds disguised as matters of state. From Henry VIII's battles with his wives to Edward VIII's abdication for love, the crown has repeatedly been shaken not by foreign invaders but by private fractures within the family. This was no different. Beneath the surface of polished appearances and carefully written speeches, the same human flaws that had undone monarchs of the past threatened to unravel the present. And in the whispers surrounding Camilla and William, one could almost hear history repeating itself. As the storm drew closer, those whispers turned into predictions. Some said William would confront her directly. Others claimed Camilla would never back down, that she had endured too much over the years to retreat now. In quiet corners, staff speculated about King Charles's role, about whether he would intervene or stand aside. But above all, there was a sense of dread that the fragile balance holding the family together could not last much longer. Those who had lived through the turmoil of Diana's years saw familiar patterns emerging. They spoke in hushed tones of how old wounds had a way of resurfacing, how the past was never truly buried. The end of this chapter comes not with an explosion of conflict, but with the quiet inevitability of what was to come. The whispers had done their work. The palace was on edge, guards more alert than usual, staff moving with caution, aides careful with every word. Camilla's decision to return had been made, and William's warning had already been delivered. The storm had not yet broken, but the air was heavy with anticipation. Everyone inside those walls knew that when it did, it would not be a minor clash or a passing quarrel. It would be a turning point, one that could not be undone. This is where the first cracks in the facade appeared, where the family's inner divisions became too sharp to ignore. The whispers that began in secrecy would soon spill into the open, and what had once been private tension would transform into a public crisis. The storm was no longer a distant threat. It was gathering, building, waiting for the moment to strike. And when it did, the crown itself would tremble under the weight of what was unleashed. The walls of Birmingham Palace have witnessed centuries of history, but few events rival the quiet, simmering divisions that have long existed between its inhabitants. In the golden halls, where chandeliers cast light on portraits of past monarchs, the air is supposed to carry the weight of legacy, tradition, and continuity. Yet, in recent months, a subtle but unmistakable fracture had emerged, dividing not just loyalties but hearts. At the center of this divide stood Queen Camilla, who, despite her formal role as consort, had never fully bridged the gap between herself and the heir apparent. On the other side stood Prince William, a man bound by duty, memory, and the weight of a mother's absence, whose patience had slowly worn thin. The palace was no longer a single organism, it had become two distinct forces, each cautious, wary, and unyielding. To understand the magnitude of this division, one must look back. William's relationship with Camilla was never simple. It was shaped not merely by her presence in his father's life but by the trauma of his childhood, the public dismantling of his family's privacy, and the unresolved grief of losing Diana, the woman whose shadow still loomed over every royal gathering. In private conversations, William often expressed frustration not at Camilla as a person, but at the role she represented. She was a reminder of betrayal, of decisions made without his consent, of a marriage that he had never fully endorsed. And while decades had passed, those feelings had not faded. Instead, they had hardened, creating an invisible wall between him and the woman who now held the title of queen. The palace, too, felt the tension. Staff and courtiers often found themselves navigating the line between obedience and discretion. Some were loyal to Camilla, having witnessed her decades-long struggle to earn acceptance. Others were steadfastly devoted to William, recognizing him as the future king and the custodian of tradition. In private moments, whispers of resentment, speculation, and fear traveled like ripples across the polished marble floors. Even minor events, such as a dinner or a scheduled meeting, became fraught with unspoken judgments. Would Camilla overstep her role again? Would William assert his authority? Every interaction carried the weight of centuries of protocol layered with personal emotion, making the palace a battlefield disguised as a residence. What complicated matters further was the invisible presence of public expectation. Britain's fascination with the monarchy is as relentless as it is unforgiving. Every gesture, every word, every glance is scrutinized, analyzed, and dissected. To the outside world, William's cool professionalism could appear distant or even harsh. Camilla's assertiveness could be misinterpreted as overreach or audacity. Within the palace, however, these actions carried deeper meaning. They were signals, markers of power and influence, and subtle declarations of who truly held sway over the future. For William, the stakes were profoundly personal. Every step Camilla took into his sphere of authority felt like a challenge, a test of loyalty not just to him but to the principles he believed should govern the monarchy. The middle of this chapter lies in the emotional toll of such a division. A palace divided is more than physical separation, it is a chasm of trust, understanding, and communication. Meetings that once flowed smoothly now required careful choreography. Private discussions were weighed against the potential for misunderstanding. Even ceremonial appearances were navigated with caution, each step choreographed to avoid conflict while signaling subtle dominance. William's interactions with Camilla had become a careful balance between politeness and firmness, a negotiation of power conducted through measured words, deliberate gestures, and unspoken boundaries. Meanwhile, Camilla, aware of the tension, responded with her own strategies, remaining poised, asserting presence in subtle ways, and demonstrating that her role was not negotiable. The emotional intensity of this divide extended beyond the two principal figures. Kate Middleton, William's wife, was caught in the middle, navigating her loyalty to her husband while maintaining the decorum expected of a duchess. She understood William's frustrations and fears, yet she also recognized Camilla's position and the decades-long struggle she had endured to achieve respect. Advisors and staff had to tread carefully, offering counsel without betraying confidences, executing tasks without appearing partial. The palace functioned like a microcosm of a nation under tension, every individual aware that a single misstep could ignite a public scandal or deepen private resentment. Historical context added another layer of complexity. The British monarchy has always been rife with divisions. From rival siblings to marital conflicts, the crown has survived because protocol and tradition often outweighed personal grievances. But what made this situation particularly combustible was the emotional weight carried by William. Unlike some heirs who viewed family disputes through a purely strategic lens, William's perspective was intertwined with the memory of his mother. Diana's absence was not merely symbolic, it was a living presence, a benchmark against which every action was measured. Camilla's ascent, no matter how legitimate, was seen by William as an intrusion into a sacred space, one that had been shaped by love, loss, and a desire to protect his family from repeated hurt. The palace was divided not just by individuals, but by the past itself. Portraits of previous monarchs stared down from their gilded frames, silent witnesses to the unfolding drama. Generations of royal history carried lessons, precedents, and warnings, all of which seemed to echo in the halls. Staff members often remarked privately on how history seemed to repeat itself, how disputes over influence and authority rarely ended without consequence. And now, with Camilla asserting herself in ways that challenged the air, those echoes were louder than ever. Every decision, every movement, every glance was freighted with meaning. Every whisper carried potential consequences. By the time Camilla made the choice to return to Birmingham Palace, the division was no longer subtle. It was palpable. Guards, aides, and even distant family members could sense the tension radiating through the halls. The stage was set for confrontation. William's authority, though not yet exercised in public, had already drawn a line in the sand. Camilla's intentions, though outwardly respectful, represented an undeniable challenge. In a palace built on centuries of hierarchy, tradition, and careful diplomacy, this moment threatened to upend all of it. The end of this chapter brings the audience to the brink of the storm. The palace was no longer unified, and every step Camilla took was laden with risk. William's resolve had hardened, staff were tense, and guards were caught between duty and loyalty. A decision had to be made, and the consequences would ripple far beyond the palace walls. The division was complete, the whispers had become a chorus, and history was poised to witness a clash that would forever alter the perception of the royal family. In this fractured environment, one could see the inevitable trajectory: authority versus defiance, tradition versus assertion, past versus future. The palace, though grand and ancient, was a stage for raw human emotion, a place where love, resentment, duty, and power collided. And as the world outside remained unaware, the seeds of confrontation had already been sown, promising a reckoning that no one inside the walls could ignore. In the intricate choreography of palace life, there are moments when a single decision can reverberate like a shockwave through centuries of tradition. For Queen Camilla, that moment arrived quietly yet with an intensity that shook the very foundation of Birmingham Palace. It was the day she chose to return, despite having been warned by the future king himself never to step foot in those halls again. The warning had been clear, unambiguous, and imbued with a force that reflected not just authority, but emotion. William had spoken with the voice of a man carrying the weight of personal history, familial duty, and the protective instincts of a son determined to preserve what he believed belonged to him. Camilla, however, had made her decision. The forbidden return was no accident, it was a deliberate act, a test of boundaries, a challenge that would set in motion events no one could have anticipated. The day began like any other in the palace, at least on the surface. Staff members moved with quiet efficiency, guards patrolled their assigned routes, and the ceremonial routines continued as if nothing had shifted. But beneath the facade of normalcy, tension hung heavy. Every footstep echoed differently. Every conversation carried weight. Those closest to William noted the rigidity in his posture, the way his hands curled into fists when he passed her portraits, and the brief, tense glances he cast toward corridors where he suspected Camilla might appear. The palace, normally a symbol of order and continuity, had become a pressure cooker of unspoken emotion, anticipation, and dread. Camilla's return was neither casual nor spontaneous. It was calculated, precise, and deliberate. She had chosen the timing, the route, and the entourage accompanying her with care. Her aides were loyal, discreet, and fully aware of the storm their queen consort was about to face. Camilla herself was no stranger to conflict. Her life had been shaped by scrutiny, criticism, and decades of public judgment. Yet the dynamics within the palace presented a unique challenge. Here, she was not simply Camilla, the resilient figure weathering decades of controversy. Here, she was Camilla, stepping into a space claimed by the future king, the son who carried both personal grief and the authority of succession. Every step she took toward the palace was a statement, every glance from her eyes a calculated assertion of presence. The moment she arrived at the gates, the atmosphere shifted palpably. Guards straightened their stances, though their expressions betrayed confusion and unease. Staff stopped mid-task, sensing that something unprecedented was about to unfold. For the first time in memory, the palace seemed to pause, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. Camilla's presence was both regal and defiant, a mixture of poise and determination that left those observing uncertain of how the day would end. Inside, William was already aware of her approach. His warning had been delivered weeks prior, yet her actions made it clear that she would not be deterred. The tension was not merely about protocol, it was about power, perception, and the fragile line between respect and defiance. What made this forbidden return particularly compelling was the intersection of emotion and authority. William was not acting out of mere stubbornness, he was driven by the weight of memory, by the protective instinct that had guided him through a lifetime shadowed by loss. His mother's absence had left a void that Camilla's presence could never fill, and yet he was forced to navigate the reality of her role within the monarchy. For Camilla, the return was an assertion of legitimacy. She had endured decades of criticism, had proven her resilience, and had been recognized formally as queen consort. In her view, stepping into the palace was not rebellion, it was her right. The collision of these perspectives created an inevitable confrontation, one where neither side could easily yield. Inside the palace, staff members whispered in anticipation. Some were loyal to William, others to Camilla, but all felt the gravity of the situation. The bodyguards, who had spent years protecting both figures, now faced the impossible task of choosing how to act should conflict arise. Their loyalty had always been to the crown, yet now the definition of loyalty was murky, fraught with personal judgment and potential consequences. Every corridor, every door, every room held the potential for confrontation, and those on the inside were acutely aware that history was about to be made, even if the outside world remained oblivious. The forbidden return also held symbolic significance. To the public, Camilla's visits to royal residences might seem routine, almost ceremonial. But within the palace walls, every movement was scrutinized for meaning. By returning despite William's warning, Camilla was sending a message that she would not be sidelined, that her authority and influence were legitimate, and that she could operate independently of the heir's approval. To William, however, this was not a message of autonomy, it was a challenge, an act of defiance that tested the boundaries of respect, loyalty, and family cohesion. This tension, invisible to those outside the palace, would ultimately dictate the course of events that night. The middle of this chapter lies in the psychological and emotional preparation of both figures. William, aware of her impending arrival, rehearsed in his mind the conversation that might occur. Would he confront her directly? Would he demand her departure before anyone else witnessed it? Could he assert his authority without fracturing the family irreparably? Meanwhile, Camilla prepared herself for resistance. She knew the potential for confrontation, understood the emotional stakes, and carried with her the experience of navigating public scrutiny and private tension alike. Both were acting with purpose, aware that the stakes extended beyond personal pride. This was a test of legacy, of succession, and of who would ultimately hold sway in the palace, and in the hearts and minds of those who served it. When Camilla finally crossed the threshold, the atmosphere was electric. Staff moved with deliberate quiet, aware that their actions would be observed, noted, and remembered. The guards, caught between protocol and loyalty, adjusted their positions, ready for instructions. William, observing from a distance, felt the surge of emotions he had long kept in check: frustration, protectiveness, anger, and a sense of inevitability. The forbidden return was not merely a physical act, it was a collision of past and future, of authority and defiance, of loyalty and family bonds stretched to their breaking point. As the chapter closes, the stage is fully set for the confrontation that would define the night. Camilla's choice to return, despite the heir's warning, had transformed a simple visit into a moment of historic significance. The palace, once a symbol of unity and tradition, now stood divided. Every figure within its walls felt the tension, knew the stakes, and understood that what unfolded next could not be undone. The forbidden return was more than a challenge, it was the spark that would ignite a storm, one that would expose the vulnerabilities, resentments, and passions that lie beneath the polished surface of the monarchy. And so, the palace waited. Guards poised, staff alert, the future king watching, and Camilla moving with quiet determination. The forbidden return had begun. History was watching, the monarchy's legacy hung in balance, and the stage was set for a confrontation that would leave no one untouched. The grandeur of Birmingham Palace has always concealed layers of complexity, layers that the public rarely glimpses. Behind the gilded doors, beneath the sparkling chandeliers and polished floors, exists a world ruled by duty, loyalty, and unspoken hierarchies. In those halls, the movements of royalty ripple outward, affecting everyone from the highest-ranking aides to the newest footman. On the day of Camilla's forbidden return, those ripples became waves, and the walls themselves seemed to pulse with tension. The staff, long accustomed to the choreography of royal life, sensed that this was no ordinary visit. Something unprecedented was about to unfold, and every individual inside the palace felt the weight of anticipation pressing down upon them. The palace staff has always operated in the shadows, executing commands with precision while maintaining discretion. Yet even their experience could not have prepared them for the emotional complexity of this situation. They watched as Camilla's entourage moved through the hallways, a calculated presence designed to assert authority without overt confrontation. Simultaneously, they observed William, restrained but unmistakably tense, navigating the corridors with the authority of the future king. The staff felt caught between these two forces, between loyalty to the reigning consort and the heir apparent whose eventual authority would shape their professional lives. Each whisper, each glance, each subtle gesture carried meaning, and the staff knew that even minor errors could be interpreted as betrayal. The bodyguards, tasked with protecting both the queen consort and the heir, faced perhaps the most difficult dilemma. Their loyalty had always been to the crown, yet the crown itself appeared divided. Some guards had served Camilla for years, witnessing her resilience in the face of public criticism and private scrutiny. Others had aligned themselves with William, believing that the future stability of the monarchy depended on his authority being respected above all else. The tension among the bodyguards was almost palpable. Quiet murmurs exchanged in hallways reflected anxiety, anticipation, and the unspoken question: who would they follow when the moment of confrontation arrived? The answer was not simple. In choosing one side, they risked angering the other, potentially creating a rift that could undermine their careers, their honor, and the monarchy itself. Behind the palace walls, the emotional stakes were just as high as the political ones. Staff members had their own fears and loyalties. Housekeepers whispered about the inevitable clash, wondering how it might affect their daily duties and relationships with the royals. Chefs, who had spent years preparing meals under strict protocols, discussed in hushed tones how tension could disrupt even routine events. Every corner of the palace was imbued with the anxiety of anticipation, and even the smallest movements were observed for signs of change. The atmosphere was thick with unspoken questions. How far would Camilla push? How firm would William's response be? Could the palace maintain decorum in the midst of what was shaping up to be a defining moment in royal history? The middle of this chapter lies in exploring the psychology of those who serve in the palace. Loyalty in the royal household is rarely straightforward. It is a mixture of duty, admiration, fear, and personal belief. Staff members navigate a delicate balance between upholding tradition, obeying orders, and maintaining personal integrity. On this day, that balance was tested like never before. Each individual had to consider the consequences of their actions, not only in the immediate moment but in the long-term trajectory of their careers and the monarchy itself. For many, the return of Camilla was more than a personal decision. It was a test of their ability to maintain composure under unprecedented pressure. As Camilla advanced through the palace, subtle signs of resistance began to emerge. A guard shifted uneasily, a door was closed slightly more forcefully than necessary, a staff member paused longer than usual before offering assistance. These small details, imperceptible to outsiders, signaled the growing tension within the palace. Camilla, aware of these dynamics, maintained her poise and dignity, but her awareness of subtle resistance only heightened the sense of confrontation. William, observing from a distance, noted these small acts of defiance and interpreted them as further confirmation that authority needed to be asserted. The palace, in every nook and corridor, was alive with the unspoken struggle for control, loyalty, and influence. Historical context adds depth to this tension. Royal palaces have always been theaters of intrigue. The delicate interplay between those who serve and those who reign has shaped the fate of monarchies for centuries. From the whispers of courtiers in the Tudor era to the behind-the-scenes maneuvering in more recent reigns, power within a palace has never been solely about titles or ceremonial duties. It is about influence, perception, and the ability to command loyalty when the stakes are highest. On the day of Camilla's return, Birmingham Palace became one of those rare moments when history's patterns repeated themselves, reminding all present that the private workings of royalty are often more intense than the public could ever imagine. The emotional strain on those within the palace cannot be overstated. Some staff members felt sympathy for Camilla, recognizing the years of public criticism and personal resilience she had endured. Others felt empathy for William, understanding that his actions were motivated by both familial duty and the memory of his mother. Everyone, however, shared a sense of foreboding. The forbidden return was no ordinary event, and even those accustomed to palace drama recognized that the coming hours could define the monarchy's narrative for years to come. As the chapter progresses toward its conclusion, the tension builds to a near breaking point. Camilla's approach to the central hall, William's guarded vigilance, the staff's quiet anxiety, and the bodyguards' careful positioning all converge in a heightened state of anticipation. Every moment is a test of composure, loyalty, and courage. The palace, once a place of ceremonial elegance, now feels like the eye of a storm, waiting for the inevitable clash between authority and defiance. The end of this chapter leaves the palace on the precipice. Camilla is inside, moving with purpose. William is observing, prepared to assert his authority. The bodyguards and staff are poised for action, aware that any misstep could have far-reaching consequences. Behind the palace walls, the tension is almost tangible, a living force that binds every person in anticipation of what comes next. The stage is fully set, the actors are in place, and the narrative that will define this chapter of royal history is poised to unfold. The forbidden return is no longer a distant threat, it is here, alive and pressing, and those who live and work behind the palace walls know that the coming hours will test not just the strength of individuals, but the resilience of the monarchy itself. The morning of Camilla's return to Birmingham Palace was unlike any other in recent memory. Outside, the sky was muted, a gray blanket of clouds casting an almost surreal calm over the palace grounds. Yet inside, the atmosphere was electric with anticipation. Those who lived and worked within the walls could sense that the day would not pass quietly. Every movement carried weight, every glance seemed loaded with meaning, and every whispered conversation hinted at the confrontation that loomed just hours away. The palace, usually a place of structured routine and ceremonial order, had become a pressure chamber of emotion, authority, and unresolved history. From the moment the first couriers began their morning rounds, staff were on edge. Housekeepers moved with precision, trying to maintain normalcy while their minds raced with speculation. Chefs prepared meals in silence, knowing that even the smallest distraction could spark a chain of events with consequences far beyond the kitchen. Guards adjusted their stances, noting every subtle shift in posture or expression, ready for a day that promised to test the limits of loyalty and obedience. The day of reckoning had arrived, and everyone within the palace was acutely aware that the balance of power, decorum, and familial authority was about to be challenged in ways no one could fully predict. Camilla's approach was deliberate, calculated, and resolute. She had not come to negotiate or apologize, she had come to assert her position, to move through the palace as a queen consort who had endured criticism, scrutiny, and exclusion, and yet remained undeterred. Her aides, trained in both discretion and strategy, flanked her carefully, ensuring that every movement was composed, every gesture precise. The entourage's demeanor signaled readiness, professionalism, and a shared understanding of the stakes. For Camilla, this return was more than a visit, it was a statement, a declaration that her role within the monarchy was both legitimate and enduring, and that she would not allow